with a public appeal for missing British backpacker Grace Millane.
The man they needed to help fill in the gaps was reported missing on December 5th. Jessie was asked to come into the station to answer some routine questions.
Tell us about Grace.
So I was talking to Grace on Tinder.
Yeah.
On the morning of December 1st, 2018, Grace put on her Converse shoes, checked her phone, and stepped out into the Auckland sunshine with nowhere particular to be, and the whole world still ahead of her. She had been traveling for weeks, free, independent, exactly where she had always dreamed of being. She was 21 years old, and tomorrow was her birthday. She had no way of knowing that she would never see it arrive, and that within days her name would be spoken in parliaments, lit up on landmarks, and carried in the grief of an entire nation. Her full name was Grace Emmy Rose Millane. She was born on December 2nd, 1996, in Brentwood, Essex, England, a date that would, years later, become impossible to say without a weight attached to it. She was the third child and only daughter in the family, with two older brothers. Her parents, David and Gillian Millane, raised their children in Wickford, Essex, a quiet commuter town southeast of London, the kind of place where everybody knows everybody, where kids grow up cycling to each other's houses and families stay close across generations. Grace was not a quiet girl. She was the kind of person who filled a room, not loudly, not aggressively, but warmly. Childhood friend Brittany Hawkes recalled weekends when Grace would make pancakes for breakfast, and the two would sing, make up dance routines, and eat pizza and cookies. Brittany later wrote of her friend, "You weren't an ordinary person. Your heart was filled with generosity. You were ambitious, stubborn, a quirky friend, forever making me laugh." That word, stubborn, mattered. Grace had a spine. She had opinions. She was not simply sweet. She was alive in the full, complicated way that real people are. Family friend Claire Bilton, who went on holiday to Mallorca with the Milanes as a child, described them as a really genuine, down-to-earth, lovely family. Cousin Hannah O'Callaghan, a teacher, had babysat Grace when they were young, and later went on shopping trips with her and her mother Gillian. Hannah would later describe it as really quite emotional to talk about Grace, not because Grace was fragile, but because she had been so vivid, so present. Grace attended St. Thomas More High School in Westcliff-on-Sea, pursuing A-level studies in media, English, and fine art during her final 2 years at the selective sixth form institution. The subjects told you something about her. Grace was not chasing the safe path. She was drawn to the creative, the expressive, or the human. She demonstrated skill in artistic pursuits and maintained an interest in creative fields. Her artwork, those who knew her noted, sometimes explored darker, more introspective themes, evidence not of a troubled mind, but of one that was genuinely curious about the world's shadows as well as its light. After school, she enrolled at the University of Lincoln, where she studied for a degree that suited her perfectly: advertising and marketing, a field that combined her creativity with her natural understanding of people. She graduated in 2018. The future, which had always seemed abstract and distant, was now right in front of her, waiting. But Grace was not ready to walk straight into an office. Not yet. She had a plan, and it was a bold one. Grace decided to go on a backpacking tour of the world during her gap year. Starting with 6 weeks in South America, she had always wanted to travel. It wasn't an impulse. It was a promise she had made to herself, perhaps as far back as those art classes in Westcliff-on-Sea when she first began imagining a life bigger than the one she could see. Grace was a hard worker, and she was keen to make money on her time off from university. She had temped at her father's office during the summer after her second year, saving, planning, preparing. She was not the kind of person who simply dreamed. She was the kind of person who showed up. She was also, like all real people, beautifully imperfect. At times, Grace was melancholy and introspective, posting cryptic comments on Twitter about mean girls and game playing. Tired of negative people, she posted in September 2016. "That trust is broken and will never be fixed," she wrote on October 7th, 2017. Grace knew disappointment. She had felt the sting of people who let her down. But she kept going. She kept booking flights, kept making plans, kept stepping out her front door in her Converse shoes. In the months after graduation, Grace set off. She spent 6 weeks in South America, immersing herself in the noise and color of Peru before continuing her journey. She arrived in New Zealand on November 20th, 2018, and traveled around the Upper North Island. She sent messages home. She called her parents. She was exactly the kind of traveler her family had always known she would be: responsible, enthusiastic, consistent. David and Gillian Millane were not worried. They had raised a capable young woman, and they knew it. She arrived in Auckland on November 30th. The city, sprawling, coastal, alive with its own particular energy, was exactly the kind of place Grace would have loved. She was staying at a hostel. She was meeting people. She was doing what she had always done, turning strangers into friends, finding the warm places in whatever room she walked into. Back in Wickford, her brother Michael was planning his wedding. Her mother Gillian was keeping the family together. Her cousin Hannah was preparing to see the family at Christmas. Nobody was afraid. Nobody had any reason to be, and yet, on the evening of November 30th, a man named Jesse Kempson messaged Grace on the Tinder dating app at 11:31 p.m. "Hi, Grace, how are you? Much planned for your weekend?" It was late, Grace replied. She mentioned that the following day was her birthday. She had no particular plans. On Kempson suggested they meet. Grace, outgoing and adventurous, and 21 years old on the eve of becoming 22, said yes. She put on her Converse shoes the next morning, stepped into the Auckland sun, and walked toward a day that would be her last. Somewhere across the city, a door was already opening. Every person who ever met Jesse Shane Kempson walked away with a different version of him. That was by design. He told one woman he was a manager at an oil company. He told another he was a law graduate. He told people he had gang connections, that he was an orphan, that he was suffering from cancer, that his cousin was an all-black, one of New Zealand's most revered sporting icons. Some of his more outrageous lies included being adopted by rich people after his mother's death, and that he had come to New Zealand on business from Australia. The lies were not random, they were architectural, each one designed to make him appear larger, more successful, more worthy of trust than the reality beneath could ever support. Jesse Kempson was, at his core, a construction, a story he told himself and then told everyone else. The truth of who he was began in a far quieter, harder place. Jesse Shane Kempson was born in the Wellington region of New Zealand in December 1991. He was raised in Wainuiomata and Porirua working-class suburbs on the fringes of Wellington, places where the hills are steep and opportunities can feel distant. His parents split when he was 3 years old. What followed was the kind of childhood that leaves marks. At his sentencing for Grace's murder, Justice Simon Moore said a pre-sentence report showed Kempson had been affected by various traumatic influences and acknowledged, "I accept that you had a volatile upbringing and that may well have influenced the person you are today." The judge's words were careful, measured, not an excuse but an acknowledgement that something had gone deeply wrong long before Grace Millane ever stepped onto a plane to New Zealand. At sentencing for a later rape conviction, Justice Venning told Kempson, "Your father was at times violent towards you. Your mother rejected you. That may go some way towards explaining your attitude towards women. You have also had a disruptive childhood with a number of different carers." The mother, according to reporting, eventually relocated overseas. He has told a number of people over the years that she was dead, but there is no proof of that. Even his own origin story became a lie. Initially, his father and grandfather worked together to raise the youngster. Eventually, though, his father met a new woman, and the families blended. Kempson played softball as a young man, junior representative level, which in New Zealand is no small thing. It gave him structure, identity, a story to tell about himself that had at least some grounding in fact. In about 2013, he moved to Australia, seemingly developing an Australian twang in his accent. What he actually did in Sydney remains largely unclear, because almost everything Kempson said about that period of his life was fabricated. He returned from Sydney in 2016 and claiming it was to care for a sick grandmother in the Auckland suburb of Takanini. Whether the grandmother was sick or even existed in the way he described was never established. Back in Auckland in 2016, Kempson settled into a pattern that would define the final years before Grace. He moved between flatmates, hostels, and rented rooms, leaving behind a trail of people who had trusted him and been deceived. A woman who shared a house with him in Auckland in 2016 told RNZ that she became uncomfortable around him. He told her he owned a $900,000 BMW and a $1.3 million house in Sydney, and that his family were successful restaurateurs looking to buy an Auckland restaurant. The stories did not fit with the fact that he rented a $170 room so small it could only fit a bed and a small closet. The flatmates grew afraid of him. One evening, when they thought Kempson was not home, they gathered in the living room to discuss how to ask him to leave. The thought was scary, the woman recalled, because we didn't want to confront him or for him to get angry. That fear was instinctive and warranted. Kempson had a way of making people feel that his rage was always just beneath the surface, always one wrong word away. Also, in 2016, he met a woman through Tinder. She became his girlfriend, and they moved in together. She recalled one incident in which he had been in tears, wanting to break up, saying, "I'm messed up, I'm damaged, I'm bad news." She replied that it was okay. "I can help you." She would come to regret those words. The relationship became abusive. She told police he tried to kill her on January 19th, 2017, by holding her in a chokehold after chasing her around the house with a knife. She left him in April 2017 and was granted a protection order, but did not file criminal charges. That decision, entirely understandable given the fear that abusers instill in their victims, would have devastating consequences, because Kempson remained free. In April 2018, 8 months before Grace Millane arrived in New Zealand, Kempson met a young British woman through Tinder. He is accused of sexually assaulting her in a motel room in Epsom, Auckland. She did not come forward immediately. She had no way of knowing that the man who had violated her would go on to kill someone else. Nobody did. Kempson had become expert at moving through the world undetected, charming when he needed to be, violent when he thought he could get away with it, and always, always lying. At the time he murdered Millane, Kempson told police he worked in sales for consulting firm Liquid Learning. He was living in a room at the City Life Hotel in central Auckland. He had no car of his own, no wealth, no status, just a phone, a Tinder profile, and an elaborate fiction about who he was and what he had. He told the woman who became his girlfriend that he was the manager of an oil company. He told Grace Millane the same thing. He claimed he was planning to visit London in 2019. He spoke of business deals and a life of success that existed entirely in his imagination. What is clear, forensically, psychologically, evidentially, is that Jesse Kempson had a documented pattern of violence against women, specifically women he met through Tinder. Specifically through the use of physical restraint around the neck, the chokehold on his former girlfriend in January 2017, the assault on a British tourist in April 2018, and then, 7 months later, Grace. On the evening of November 30th, 2018, he opened Tinder. At 11:31 p.m., he messaged Grace. "Hi, Grace, how are you? Much planned for your weekend?" she replied. She told him it was her birthday the next day. He suggested they meet for drinks. The exchange continued casually, with Grace mentioning her Converse shoes. She agreed to the plans around 3 a.m. Kempson, who had spent years perfecting the art of becoming whoever the person in front of him needed him to be, was ready. The date was set. A birthday was approaching. And somewhere in the architecture of his lies and his violence and his carefully constructed false self, a door had already been decided. Grace Millane was walking straight toward it. December 1st, 2018 began like any other day for a young woman on the adventure of her life. Grace spent the morning the way she had spent most of her days in New Zealand, exploring, photographing, sharing what she saw with the people she loved back home. She spent the day exploring the city and capturing images of the sights, sharing them on social media. Auckland was golden in early summer. She had no obligations, no schedule, no reason to be anywhere except exactly where she chose to be. It was, in every outward sense, a perfect day. That evening, she got ready to meet Jesse Kempson. They had agreed to meet near the iconic Sky Tower, one of Auckland's most recognizable landmarks, a safe and public place in the heart of the city. Grace had been sensible. She had chosen an open location. She had told her friend, Amina Ashcroft, who was in Dubai, about the date as it unfolded, messaging her throughout the evening. This was a woman who took her safety seriously, who stayed connected to the people she trusted. The evening at first appeared to go well. Grace messaged Amina, "I'm on a date with a guy who is a manager of an oil company." She sent another, "Cocktails all round." And then, he was like, "It's my birthday tomorrow. We are getting smashed." The messages were light, playful, the kind a young woman sends when she is having a good time and wants to share it. Amina later told police she could tell Grace was drunk because she was making typos and expressing how much she missed and loved her. Grace would send "I love you" messages sober, but she wouldn't express it to this degree unless she was tipsy or drunk. At 9 p.m., Grace was seen on Victoria Street in Auckland's central business district. 15 minutes later, she was captured on security cameras at Sky City, The couple moved between venues across the evening, laughing, talking, kissing. At 8:27 p.m., Kempson paid their tab. They had consumed 3 jugs, 2 of margaritas and 1 of sangria. Their hostess said Grace was happy when they left. Then they moved to the Bluestone Room pub, where those who saw them described them as chatting and appearing at ease with each other. And Grace sent her final messages to Amina from somewhere inside those last hours of warmth and ordinary happiness. "Literally, I click with him so well," she told her friend. She said she would let Amina know what happened the next day. There would be no message the next day. At 9:41 p.m., Grace was captured on CCTV at the City Life Hotel on Queen Street, walking into an elevator with Jesse Kempson. She is smiling. He has his hand near her. The doors close. That image, Grace alive and unaware, stepping into a lift she would never step out of, would later be shown to a courtroom, to a country, to the world. It would become one of the most haunting pieces of footage in New Zealand criminal history. What happened inside that hotel room in the hours that followed was established by forensic science, digital evidence, and the testimony of expert witnesses during trial. Grace Millane was strangled to death. According to Dr. Simon Stables, who testified at trial, Kempson would have had to apply significant pressure to Millane's neck for at least 4 to 5 minutes in order to kill her. 4 to 5 minutes, long enough to know, long enough to stop. Kempson did not stop. The Crown testified that after killing her, Kempson conducted several internet searches on how to dispose of bodies, as well as viewing pornography. He also, in one of the most disturbing details of the entire case, snapped 7 photographs of Millane after she was dead. Then, with her body still in his hotel room, he went to sleep. The next morning, December 2nd, 2018, Grace's birthday. The day her family in Wickford, Essex, sent messages of love across the distance, expecting the warmth and quick reply they always got from their daughter and sister. CCTV captured Kempson entering an elevator at 8 a.m. He later purchased a suitcase and cleaning supplies before renting a car. That same day, he went on another Tinder date with a different woman. That detail deserves a moment of stillness. While Grace's body lay in his room, while her family's birthday messages went unanswered, while her friend Amina waited for a follow-up text that would never come, Kempson sat across from another woman in a bar and made conversation. He was, by every account, composed. During that date, Kempson told the woman he had heard of a man who had asked his girlfriend to have rough sex involving strangulation, and she had died during the process. He said the man got done for manslaughter. He also told her that police were having a really tough time because bodies kept going missing in the Waitakere Ranges, and that police dogs could only smell remains buried more than 4 feet under. He was, prosecutors would later argue, quietly rehearsing his defense, testing it, watching to see if it was believable. Less than 24 hours after murdering Grace, Kempson smuggled her body down the elevator and out of the hotel in the newly purchased suitcase. Surveillance footage later showed him using a trolley to transport 2 heavy suitcases into an elevator and loading them into the trunk of his rental car. On the morning of December 3rd, Kempson left City Life at 6:15 a.m., stopped at a store to purchase a shovel, and drove into the Waitakere Ranges. Dense bush, winding roads, about 19 kilometers west of central Auckland, where he buried Grace in a shallow grave. He then returned the rental car, cleaned it at a self-service car wash, and discarded evidence. Back in Wickford, David and Gillian Millane waited. The birthday messages went unanswered through December 2nd, then December 3rd, then December 4th. Grace's parents became concerned and reported her missing to police, who initially said there was no evidence of foul play. But the hostel where Grace had been staying confirmed she had not returned to her room on the night of her disappearance. Something was wrong. Parents know. As Auckland police launched a search and began reviewing Grace's social media accounts, Detective Diana Levinson noticed a comment left on Grace's Facebook page. Underneath her profile picture, Jesse Kempson had written, "Beautiful and very radiant." He had posted it at 9:29 p.m. on December 1st, the night Grace went missing. He immediately became a person of interest. Police reached out. Kempson agreed to speak. He was calm. He was cooperative. He told them he and Grace had gone on a date, had a lovely evening, and parted ways around 10 p.m. He had no idea where she was. But the CCTV footage told a different story entirely. It showed them entering that elevator at 9:41 p.m. It showed Kempson leaving the next morning. It showed Grace never leaving at all. On December 8th, police announced they were treating the case as a homicide investigation, and Kempson was taken into custody at 3 p.m. In his second formal interview, he admitted Grace had died in his room, but insisted it was an accident. On December 9th, at around 4 p.m., Grace Millane's body was found off Scenic Drive in the Waitakere Ranges, around 19 kilometers west of central Auckland. A detective at the scene described what they found. There was a naked female lying inside the suitcase. She was in a fetal position. Her head was facing down towards where the wheels were. She was 22 years old. She had been alive 1 week earlier. Across New Zealand and across the world, the grief arrived like a wave. A young woman had come to this country to see its beauty, and she had been murdered on her birthday. In Auckland, people who had never met Grace Millane wept. In Wickford, a family's world collapsed entirely. And the investigation, the full, unrelenting pursuit of truth and accountability, had only just begun. Detective Inspector Scott Beard had worked major crimes for years, and he had seen cases go cold, seen evidence unravel, seen guilty men walk. But from the very first moment his team began pulling on the threads of Grace Millane's disappearance, he knew something was deeply, irreversibly wrong. The fact that on her birthday she hadn't contacted her family, and her family hadn't been able to contact her, that was a huge red flag, Beard later said. Missing persons cases were not uncommon. Young travelers sometimes went quiet for days, but not on their birthdays, not when their families were expecting them, not when the last person to see them had already been identified as someone who lied professionally, casually, and constantly. The investigation that followed was meticulous, methodical, and ultimately overwhelming in its evidence. The police secured 6 terabytes of CCTV footage from across central Auckland. Every camera in every bar, restaurant, hotel lobby, and street corner that Grace and Kempson had passed through on the night of December 1st. The footage showed Millane and the accused on that fateful night after they had matched on Tinder, including moments where they were seen kissing. And it showed Grace entering the City Life Hotel at 9:41 p.m. It showed her never coming out. When Kempson came in voluntarily for his first police interview, he was calm, presentable, cooperative. He told officers that he and Grace had gone on a date, had a good evening, and parted ways around 10 p.m. He said he had no idea where she was. At one point during the interview, when he was left alone, he knocked on the door and asked a passing police officer, "Am I being arrested for something I didn't do?" But a simultaneous team was already working through the CCTV footage, and the cracks in his story were appearing fast. "We know he's a liar. He's very comfortable and plausible in his lies, and he's very believable," Detective Beard later said. A search warrant was issued for Kempson's apartment at City Life, and forensic officers moved through it with luminol, a chemical that reacts to trace blood and glows in the dark. When they saw the results inside Kempson's apartment, Beard's reaction was visceral. When you see the luminol, which is indicating all the blood in that room, you go, "Oh my gosh, what's he done?" The physical evidence was only the beginning. Kempson's phone was seized and forensically examined. What investigators found on it was chilling in its completeness. At around 1:30 a.m. on December 2nd, while Grace's body was still in his room, Kempson had searched Waitakere Ranges, followed minutes later by Hottest Fire. Hours later, at around 6 a.m., he searched Rigor Mortis, Extra Large Bags, and Carpet Cleaner. Later that afternoon, he searched Flesh-Eating Birds and Are There Vultures in New Zealand? He was not panicking. He was planning. The CCTV evidence of Kempson's movements in the hours and days after the murder was presented in court as a damning visual timeline. On the morning of December 2nd, he left City Life to buy a suitcase at the warehouse on Elliott Street around 8 a.m. He returned to City Life, then left again to purchase cleaning products with cash at a supermarket. Genola, gloves, wipes. He then caught a taxi to a car hire company and rented a vehicle. That evening, he drove to a Countdown supermarket on Key Street, where he hired a Rug Doctor carpet cleaning machine. Around 9:30 p.m., he was seen wheeling a baggage trolley to his room, then back into the lift with 2 heavy suitcases. At 6 a.m. the following morning, December 3rd, he drove the rental car to a hardware store west of Auckland and bought a red shovel with cash. He then drove into the Waitakere Ranges and buried Grace in a shallow grave off Scenic Drive. He returned, cleaned the rental car at a self-service car wash, filled it with petrol, and deposited Grace's belongings into a rubbish bin in Albert Park before slowly walking away. Grace's parents reported her missing on December 5th. 3 days later, on December 8th, police announced they were treating the case as a homicide investigation, and Kempson was taken into custody at 3 p.m. In his second formal interview, conducted with his lawyer present, Kempson changed his story entirely. He said he purchased a suitcase because he was freaking out. He claimed, "I went to the warehouse at the atrium and bought a suitcase. I remember putting Grace in the suitcase. I was just in shock the whole time." He said he panicked, said it was an accident, said he had buried her because he did not know what else to do. When asked directly whether he had murdered her, he replied, "No." He later took police to where Grace was buried. When detectives arrived at the Scenic Drive site, they found small areas where the clay on the ground had been overturned. They quickly identified a grave site. A Grace Millane was found on December 9th, 2018, 1 week after her birthday. The trial began on November 4th, 2019, at the Auckland High Court. Nearly 3 weeks of testimony, 39 witnesses. The jury, 7 women and 5 men, heard 2 entirely different narratives of what had happened inside that hotel room. The Crown's case, led by solicitor Brian Dickey, was built on evidence so extensive and so damning that it left almost no room for doubt. 3 female witnesses who had met Kempson through Tinder testified that he had shown a documented interest in choking during sex. The forensic pathologist, Dr. Simon Stables, testified that a post-mortem examination found bruising consistent with restraint and asphyxiation, and that significant, sustained pressure would have had to be applied to Grace's neck, the phone searches. The 7 photographs taken of her body, the carpet cleaner, the suitcase, the shovel, the grave. Dickey told the jury that Kempson had eroticized the death of Grace Millane and that the trophy photographs represented the ultimate triumph for the defendant over Grace Millane. The defense, led by barrister Ian Brookie, argued that Grace had asked Kempson to choke her, that she had died accidentally during consensual activity, and that his frantic concealment of the body was the behavior of a frightened man, not a murderer. The defense's expert pathologist contested the Crown's autopsy findings, claiming the injuries were consistent with a consensual act due to the lack of defensive wounds. It was a defense that would later be widely condemned as a brutal second violation of grace. Her character attacked, her choices distorted, or her death blamed upon herself. The jury saw through it entirely. On November 22, 2019, after deliberating for just 5 hours, the jury of 7 women and 5 men returned a unanimous guilty verdict. Some jurors broke down and sobbed as they left the courtroom. Outside, Grace's father, David Millane, who had sat through every day of that 3-week trial, who had watched his daughter's final CCTV images played again and again in a public courtroom, who had heard her name and her choices dissected and distorted by a defense team working to save the man who killed her, spoke to journalists. Grace was a beautiful, talented, loving daughter. Grace was our sunshine, and she will be missed forever, he said. Our lives have been ripped apart. This will be with us for the rest of our lives. On February 21, 2020, Nick Kempson stood before Justice Simon Moore for sentencing. The judge addressed him directly. You didn't ring an ambulance or call the police. Instead, you embarked on a well-planned and sustained and coordinated course of action to conceal any evidence of what had occurred in your room, Justice Moore said. Kempson was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum non-parole period of 17 years. He would not be eligible for parole until 2037, when he would be 45 years old. In 2020, in 2 separate judge-alone trials held under strict secrecy, Kempson was convicted of 9 further charges: the rape, sexual violation, physical, sexual, emotional, and financial abuse of an ex-girlfriend, and the rape of a second British woman he had met through Tinder in April 2018, 8 months before Grace. Both women had come forward after recognizing him as Grace's killer. Their courage ensured his full history was finally on record. Detective Inspector Scott Beard, standing outside the court after sentencing, spoke quietly and honestly. The impact of losing their daughter on her birthday in a foreign country has been devastating. No matter what this outcome today, they will forever have a life sentence. He was right. The justice was real. The sentence was just. But no verdict, however unanimous, however swift, however morally certain, brings a daughter back. Some losses hollow a family out completely. Some losses, against every reasonable expectation, transform into something else. Not healing exactly, never quite that, but purpose, action, love made visible in the world in a way it couldn't be before. The Millane family has lived both of those truths simultaneously since December 2018. David Millane, the father who sat through every day of the 3-week trial, who had watched his daughter's final CCTV images replayed in a courtroom, who had spoken to journalists outside and called Grace his sunshine, died of cancer in November 2020, just 1 year after the verdict that was supposed to bring some measure of peace. He never got to see Kempson's name finally made public. He never got to see the charity his wife built in Grace's name grow into something extraordinary. He carried his grief for 2 years, and then he was gone. The family had already lost so much. Then they lost him too. In an interview around the time of the New Year honors, Millane said she had been plunged into darkness after her daughter's death, and at one point contemplated taking her own life. She said it plainly, without drama. It was simply what had happened. The darkness had been real and total, and yet she came through it, not because the grief lifted, but because she found something to do with it. In the aftermath of Grace's murder, Gillian and cousin Hannah O'Callaghan founded a charity called Love Grace. Aimed at empowering victims of domestic abuse, the concept was beautifully, heartbreakingly simple. Collect donated handbags, fill them with toiletries, shampoo, conditioner, shower gel, deodorant, toothpaste, toothbrush, and give them to women in women's refuge shelters. Grace had loved handbags. It was a way to keep her close. When it started in 2019, the charity began with between 50 and 100 handbags. That number grew. Then it grew again. By the time of this writing, Love Grace has filled over 23,000 handbags. In New Zealand alone, one annual appeal set a target of 1,500 handbags for the whole country and received 5,269. There are now 120 drop-off points throughout New Zealand and 163 volunteers. The charity also raises money for the White Ribbon campaign in both the United Kingdom and New Zealand, organizations that educate men and boys on attitudes that contribute to violence against women. Grace, who studied advertising and marketing, who understood how ideas move through communities, would have known exactly what her family had built. In the British 2024 New Year honors, both Gillian Millane and Hannah O'Callaghan were appointed officers of the Order of the British Empire for services to charitable fundraising and tackling violence against women. Gillian received her OBE at Windsor Castle, describing it as truly a special day and one that will last forever. Hannah O'Callaghan said of Grace, "I don't think she would believe how big Love Grace has become and how many women we can help by offering a bit of normality to. She would have also probably been amused that we have been to Downing Street and are now to meet a member of the royal family." It is, in every sense, a tribute worthy of who Grace was. Gillian has spoken about her driving force. "I just don't want another family, another mom, dad, brother, sister, auntie, friends, to have to live the life that we do. I just want to help. Darlin', to sort of hopefully raise the awareness, hopefully change things. She has been training to climb Mount Kilimanjaro and trekking to Mount Everest Base Camp. She said the climbs give her a reason to get out of bed. I climb mountains every day, she said, even if it's getting out of bed. Anybody that lives in this world, whether you've had someone taken from you, a win is getting up and having a shower sometimes. This is what grief looks like when it refuses to be only grief." Grace's case also triggered a significant and still unfinished legal conversation across the English-speaking world. The so-called rough sex defense, the legal strategy Kempson's team used to argue that Grace had consented to the violence that killed her, became a flashpoint for campaigners, lawmakers, and survivors who had long known this defense existed and long known the damage it did. Following sustained campaigning, in which the Millane family played a central role, a new law was introduced in England and Wales, establishing that rough sex cannot be considered a defense to violent crime. A new statutory aggravating factor was brought in for offenders who caused death through abusive or degrading sexual conduct, making clear in law what should have always been self-evident, that no one can consent to being strangled to death. That strangulation is not a bedroom preference, it is a weapon. Detective Inspector Scott Beard, who led Grace's investigation, said of the rough sex defense, "Essentially, it re-victimizes the victim and their families, and the victim isn't there to answer." His words carry the weight of someone who watched a grieving family sit in a courtroom and listen to their daughter's character attacked, her choices distorted, her murder reframed as her own fault. He watched that happen, and he spoke against it. And so did Gillian, and so did Hannah, and so did the filmmaker Helena Cohn. In September 2024, a 92-minute documentary called The Lie was released on Netflix, becoming the streaming service's #1 film in New Zealand. Directed by Helena Cohn and made with the blessing of Grace's family, the film focused not just on what was done to Grace, but on what was done to her memory in that courtroom, and on why that must never be allowed to happen again. Its title was deliberate. The lie was the defense, when the lie was the suggestion that Grace bore any responsibility for her own death. As for Jesse Kempson, he sits today in Auckland prison. He will be 45 years old when he is first eligible for parole in 2037. Every appeal he has launched has failed. Every attempt to have his name suppressed, to have his conviction overturned, to have his additional rape sentences reduced, all of it has been rejected by New Zealand's courts at every level, including the Supreme Court. The two other women he violated, women who came forward because they recognized the blurred face on their television screens, were told by courts that their experiences were real, that their pain was real, that the man who hurt them would face consequence for it. The Millane family, in a statement, said simply, "As a family, we do not think about him or speak his name." That restraint, that refusal to give him any more space in their lives than he has already taken, is its own kind of dignity. What does Grace Millane's case tell us about the world we live in? It tells us that danger does not always look dangerous, that the man who charmed his way into a woman's life while constructing an elaborate fiction about who he was had already hurt people, and that the systems that should have caught him had gaps wide enough for a killer to walk through. It tells us that dating apps, for all the connection they offer, require from us a trust that the platforms themselves do not verify. It tells us that the rough sex defense was not born in that Auckland courtroom. It had been used before. It had worked before. And it would have worked again had Grace's jury been less clear-eyed. It tells us that grief, when given purpose, can move mountains. And it tells us that a young woman from Wickford, Essex, stubborn and creative and generous and alive, deserved every single birthday she never got to have. She deserved to return home. She deserved to begin her career in advertising, to design the things she had studied to design, to make her parents proud in the ordinary ways that children do. She deserved to dance badly at her brother's wedding, to be in those photographs, not conspicuously absent from them. She deserved the whole wide world she had set out to see. Her name was Grace Emmy Rose Millane. She was 21 years old, and the world was open in front of her, and she put on her Converse shoes and walked into it with her whole heart. We will not forget her. We should not forget her. The least we owe her is to say her name, to see her fully, and to make sure that what was done to her and what was done to her memory in that courtroom is never, ever called anything other than what it was: grace. The world is less bright without you in it.